Well, good evening. As I said, I'm Aaron Stauffer. I'm the Louisville Institute postdoctoral fellow here at the Wendland-Cook Program and Vanderbilt Divinity School. And welcome to our event tonight, Churches and Cooperatives, Building a New Economy. I'm really excited you're here. We've got a lot that we're going to cover this evening. We're really excited on the first half to launch a toolkit that can equip churches and cooperatives and churches working on cooperatives and alongside in the cooperative and solidarity economy. This link should be placed in the chat relatively quickly, if not right now. And we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight, along with a number of other things. But this is really a new moment for us here at the Wendland-Cook Program with the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development. So we're really glad that you're here to share with us. I want you to first off, just take a look around the Zoom room. You know, this is not a webinar. We've got a Zoom meeting. And we wanted to do this so that you could feel the presence of others here with you. We wanted to make sure that you saw their faces or their names. And I wanted to encourage you to put in the chat where you're from and what your name is. Tell us where you're coming from, what your organization is. Tell us a little bit about yourself. I want to know a little bit about who we got in this room tonight. I want to begin that way because it's really important that we get a sense that we're not in this work alone, that we've got each other, and that there is a network of freedom fighters, of fellow, travelers on the road of justice that we can build solidarity with. So scroll through the Zoom room, take a look, see if you see anybody familiar, and just welcome. I'm really glad that you're here. There are a couple of housekeeping items that I need to cover here, and Sam has already put this in the chat, so please take a look at that. This webinar this meeting is live streamed on Facebook. So if you would prefer to not have your video and your face on that, please go ahead and turn your video off. That's more than fine. Rather than being a webinar function where we have a Q&A function here, what we really have is we've got, this is a Zoom meeting, so the participation is going to be a really important part of this. So if you have questions that occur to you throughout the program, go ahead and put them in the chat. And we've got a couple of staff people who are working to capture those questions and make sure that my role is, and my job as the moderator is to make sure that I'm seeing them and that we can pose them. We'll have a period for question and answers at around the last 15 to 10 minutes of our conversation together. So let me begin with a little bit of a story. About a year ago, the Louisville Institute decided to generously support a project of the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development and the Wendland-Cook Program that was exploring the relationship between worker cooperatives and churches. Facing rampant inequality in a racialized economic order, this project believes, the Wendland-Cook Program and the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development believes that the future of the church is at stake in responding to and providing solutions to this crisis. And that in order to sustain and grow churches and faith communities, that we really need to live into a new a new collective way of life. This work, right, of economic equity, of solidarity, of cooperation. This is not merely just an expression of the outreach committee, but is actually really living into the vocation of what it means to be the church today. And that's what our conversation is going to revolve around. It'll revolve around this project of the Churches and Cooperatives Toolkit. What are the solutions and answers that we think are the most viable today? And how it is that you can get involved. Because that's the real important thing here. We're not just here to tell you about an answer. We want to get you involved. We want you to sign up and join a new project that we've got launching here in the spring called Solidarity Circles. And Solidarity Circles will be peer networks of clergy, faith leaders, organizers who are interested in working in and alongside the cooperative and solidarity economy to address a number of different issues. We'll talk a little bit more about the Solidarity Circles later. Stephen Handy, one of our panelists, is going to be a participant in this, so we've got a chance really to kind of to envision together what this work can be. But without further ado, let me introduce the panelists that we've got here, and we'll start our conversation. So our first panelist tonight is Stephen Handy. Reverend Stephen Handy is the lead pastor at McHenry United Methodist Church. in Nashville, Tennessee, and he's a passionate communicator that desires to speak God's truth. So people of different cultures, experiences, neighborhoods, and all of God's unique diversity can be reconciled through this work of the church. Stephen is a strong advocate of restorative justice, serving the poor and the needy, and participating in groups for spiritual formation and accountability. Stephen, you were a member of the Churches and Cooperatives Collaborative Inquiry Team that was funded by the Louisville Institute. I'm really glad you're here tonight. Thank you for your time. Our next panelist is Benny Overton, and he is the co-executive director of the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development, which was really, along with the Wendland-Cook Program, the lead on this collaborative inquiry team grant by the Louisville Institute. Benny is the former president of the United Autos Worker Local in 737 in Nashville. His other roles have included the vice president of Nashville Organized for Action and Hope, which is the local Gamaliel affiliate here in Nashville, Tennessee. He's been the president of the Dixon County branch of the NAACP, the vice president of the Central Labor Council of Nashville and Middle Tennessee, and an adjunct professor at Tennessee State University. Benny, we're really excited to have you as a part of our conversation tonight too. Thanks for being here.
Likewise, thanks.
And our final guest tonight is the wonderful Bianca Vasquez. She is the program director at the Beloved Community Incubator in Washington, DC, and she's a community organizer who has lived and worked in Washington, DC for 10 years. Neighborhood listening sessions led Bianca to engage in small micro business projects with local residents, which eventually led to the founding of the Beloved Community Incubator. She believes in the power of worker ownership to sustainably and substantially transform communities and the economy. Her favorite question is, and this is a great one, to whom have you been given to love? So thank you all for being here tonight. I'm really excited about the conversation. I want to begin really where this conversation has really started with the Churches and Cooperatives Toolkit here, and begin with Stephen, this question around what are the challenges that are facing the churches, and actually what are the opportunities that cooperatives provide for the thriving of churches. You know, I think let me just, very briefly, I was talking to an organizer this morning, and one of the things he was talking to me about is how it is that a lot of, he's an organizer in North Carolina. One of the things he was talking to me about was how it is that so many of the churches that he works with feel a number of things. One, they feel isolated. They feel burned out. But they also don't feel that there are actual substantial solutions to providing economic power to the actual challenges that they face. Rather than just looking for another grant, he's curious about how it is that they can create alternative economies and actually live into and create into the beloved community. So I wonder if you might talk with us and sort of leave, that might be the starting point. You know, what are the opportunities for the churches here, and how is this actually living into the mission and vocation of the church?
Thank you, Aaron, and welcome everyone to this Power Summit. I'm excited about what God is about to do in the midst of this gathering. One of the interesting kind of components of this work that we do in downtown Nashville as a Methodist church is I kind of listen to the prophet Jeremiah, where he says, seek the welfare of the city. And it goes on to say, for in its welfare, you will discover your own welfare. So I think about who we are as God's humanity and what is our agency. And this agency is really about building not only the beloved community, but the better community. We have to be people of goodness and not people of rightness. And so living in a world of margins, where Jesus spent the majority of his time, Jesus is always trying to connect the dots. He doesn't use that language. That's not part of the Greek translation, by the way, but it's kind of today's vernacular. How do we find the people who have commonality? And by the way, we're all made in the image of God. At least that's what the text says. I have a tendency to believe that at a deep level. If we can find ways for the church, right, the body of Christ, to realize that it needs each other. The brain power is in the diversity, the equity, and the inclusion of these people that develops and lives into the sense of justice. Where there is justice, there is liberation. Where there is liberation, there is a sense of freedom. And so we have in Nashville, we brag, and it's not something we really need to brag about. We have a church on every corner. And the challenge of the churches being on every corner is we don't play well together. So we've recently discovered in downtown Nashville, we started what we call the Downtown Neighborhood Association. If you're a church, we say we belong together. And we're starting now to brain trust about opportunities around homelessness. And so here's what we recently discovered, that we have more in common, but we've never shared our stories. We just recently reached out to HUD to create a community development corporation. And we're decided as 6 to 8 churches that it's not about one of us, it's about the collective genius of all of us. And so now we're starting to put down strategies, trying to understand our context better, and really trying to invite us as beloved sojourners on this pilgrimage. What does it look like for the kingdom of God to come on earth as it is in heaven? And so we said part of that is, Aaron and those who are listening, is this whole idea of what is equity? What does the alternative economy look like? And we in this season with the pandemic get to discover, in many cases, rediscover what does it mean for us to work together, to share together, to vision together, to create values together, as opposed to these isolated communities called the church, where they're doing their own things. And we're not collaborating, we're not consulting, we're not conversing. And so, Aaron, I would say at the end of the day, we're seeing a movement of people realizing it's time for the walls to come down and for us to look at each other, appreciate each other, embrace each other as the one who we call our Redeemer did and still does.
Thanks so much for that, Stephen. I think what I really like about this is that just the recognition, and this is true of any sort of, and a lot of the stories I've heard about starting cooperatives, that it begins with just doing some basic investigation of what an alternative economy can look like, right? And what are the values then that ground that? And this is where I want to turn to Benny and Bianca to get a little sense, okay, once churches begin to talk to each other, as you're talking about, once they begin to get to say, hey, there are common problems that we face, and a lot of them have to do with the economy. So how is it that we build an alternative economy? Oftentimes, people miss the fact that the cooperative movement is a deeply value-driven movement, that it's founded on 7 core values that are deep, that can be deeply theological. But before we get to that, I don't want people to miss that starting small, starting on the relational building, starting on the investigation and the basic learning of study group of what a cooperative is a great place to start, and that it's value driven, right? That it's this deeply, as you're talking about, this is deeply all about, about concern for the community, about cooperation, about education, but also about autonomy. I've just listed about 4 or 5 of these values of the cooperative movement, right? So all of these are right there. What I want to do is now is just turn it to Benny and to Bianca. And so we've talked a little bit about the sort of theological impetus to get into cooperatives. But can you talk to me a little bit about what are the basic aspects of cooperatives here? And Benny, if you wanted to weave this a little bit on the genesis of the CIT project, that's great. But the essential elements and values of a cooperative.
Yeah. And let me begin by just briefly defining just what a worker cooperative is. It's a principle-guided business enterprise that's owned by workers and is controlled by workers. And it's controlled via a democratic governance or democratic processes. And you mentioned some of the principles, but I would like to just real quickly go through the 7 principles. so that people know exactly, because this is something that distinguishes co-ops from the conventional businesses, is the principles that form our basis and foundation. One is open and voluntary membership. And I'll just go through them. Democratic member control. Members' economic participation, meaning you got skin in the game. Autonomy and independence. Education, training, and information, which is key. Concern for our community. And these are the principles that guide the co-op throughout its life. Some of the values that are important to co-ops include democracy, of course, because democracy is at the core of co-ops. Equality, equity, openness, solidarity, honesty, and caring for others. Because it's about cooperation rather than the competition. So cooperatives are about cooperating rather than competing. And I would say this about why I got into, came to co-ops. My background is a union officer. And union and co-ops have in common the attempt to address the power imbalance between labor and capital, or labor and management, which are agents of capital. And it's the imbalance that exists here that is really causing a lot of the problems. Because it's this imbalance that I guess requires a subordination or leads to a subordination of labor and the primacy of capital. And so we have a profit maximization at work that dehumanizes workers and labor. And we see evidence of this in the inequalities that we have. The income inequality, was the pay ratio for the management or CEO and workers at one time was about 20 to 1. Today is more like 320 to 1. So it's obscene income inequality. And then wealth inequality is even worse. And we ask ourselves, how did this happen? And not only how did it happen, but why does it persist? And not only persisting, but it's worsening. So we have this dehumanization. It's what Reverend James Lawson called the plantation capitalism, because it is an extreme form of capitalism that devalues humanity. And it leads to a situation where a person who works, we have many people, too many, who have to work 2 or 3 jobs just to sustain themselves in their household. And at this time, we are risking the planet. The planet is at risk of becoming uninhabitable because of the extraction and contamination that's done in the pursuit of greater profits. And it's really in the pursuit of greed. So it's this devaluation of humanity. And this is, I think, where churches come in and have a role to address that. Unions try to address this imbalance contractually and try to mitigate the imbalance by having provisions in the contracts that protects workers' rights. Co-ops are able to eliminate this imbalance structurally because the labor is the owner of capital and co-op. So they're one and the same. So you don't have the subordination, which is a perverse way of viewing human beings anyway, to subordinate a human being to capital. But co-ops are able to eliminate that imbalance because they're one and the same. And at this point, I think I would let Bianca come in if that's what.
Yeah, I think this is wonderful. Bianca, one of the things that you've got such a rich experience here, and I'm so happy that you're with us tonight. I wonder what Benny has wonderfully laid out for us is how it is that cooperatives and the cooperative economy can address the basic failures of our current economic system and are value driven. But there's also been, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about the solidarity and the cooperative economic movement. Like perhaps people on this webinar have heard of these things, but getting a deeper sense about what it's all about and you put this in the chat here too, that more than half the worker co-ops in the United States were explicitly started to deal with racial and economic inequality. Like, that's what it's about. Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, well, so I think there's a couple of things to talk about. Something I'd like to talk about is, and Benny spoke to this, is that value-wise, profit maximization is the top value, and a corporation or a larger business is accountable to its shareholders. It's not accountable to the community that it's in, and it's certainly not accountable to its workers. And so when we're talking about broad solidarity economy movements, the underlying values are around mutuality, cooperation, solidarity. That's really distinct from the way that our normal businesses are structured. There aren't just worker cooperatives, so I want to name that as well. And there's a lot of things that would fall under that larger umbrella of solidarity economy, and worker cooperatives would be one piece of that. But when I think about cooperatives, there's producer cooperatives, there's consumer cooperatives, there's credit unions. In DC, I live in Washington, DC, and we have one of the largest concentration of housing cooperatives, so tenant-owned buildings. But the theme of that is, who are those businesses or kind of like economic structures accountable to? And it's often to its communities and to its members, and that's really different. So you have a lot of things that would fall under the solidarity economy. Things that would also fall under a solidarity economy that might not count as a traditional business, mutual aid efforts. And also, I would put a lot of church activities would fall under that umbrella of solidarity economy, because churches can be accountable to their members. They actually have a lot of economic democracy practice. And also, churches often feel accountable to their larger communities. I think the thing I like to focus on about cooperatives, one is about ownership, like who owns the land, who owns their labor, who owns the building. But I also want to talk about access to public life. And so Benny just talked about how people have to work 2 and 3 jobs. And that means workers can't participate in their communities. They can't give back to their kids' schools. A lot of people don't feel like they have enough time to give to their children, and then are cut off from participating sometimes in church, but also other community activities that could benefit them and their neighbors. So those are just sort of a broad stroke. Lots of things fall under the solidarity economy. I came into working with worker co-ops out of community-based organizing and community listening that was happening while I was on staff at a downtown church in Washington, DC. And we, right after the 2016 election, we're doing this listening, and every single person talked about how their workplace had gotten worse. They were experiencing wage theft, abuse at work, no control over their hours, last minute schedule shifts, at-will employment. And it was really distressing to hear, and really Ignorance on Fire came into co-ops. I was inspired by another church in Detroit, Michigan, Grace in Action Church and Collectives, that were organizing cooperatives, and said, I think we can do this, and sort of stumbled into this work. But what is really powerful for me, and I want 30 more seconds, is that the cleaning cooperative that we started, that is owned, has 5 worker owners, is now in its 3rd year of operation. They're expanding and franchising this year, or into next year, so there'll be a second cleaning cooperative. They had total control over how they responded to the pandemic. When they went back to work, how they went back to work, what were the safety measures, how were they going to pay themselves, and what they were going to do with profit at the end of the year. And that is a level of control and ownership over one's life and the conditions of one's labor that, really has not stopped inspiring me. But cooperatives and solidarity economy movements explode during times of market failure. So we're in a really critical moment for churches and communities to really examine what the COVID-19 pandemic, the inequalities that it has really both shown us and exacerbated, and then how we choose to respond.
Thank you so much. This is what you've given us. These points are just so crucial. I mean, first off, this notion that cooperative and solidarity economies grow in moments of crises and market failures is so true, but it's also like just reminds me of that capitalism is driven by crises, that this extractive system depends, it drives human and ecological crises. It's a natural byproduct of it. And the alternative of it, right? This democratic, worker-owned, worker-controlled economy is deeply theological, right? This is absolutely, it seems to me, what it means to be a part of the community of God. It's about being able to experience that sort of freedom that comes from being a member of the church, which includes having freedom over self and having autonomy and freedom over one's work. So these things are, I just, again, like, I think this translation here for us is, or even putting it in different language, is part of what the work here involves, to say, like, worker owner cooperatives and the cooperative and solidarity economy. The old school social gospel used to call this building the kingdom of God, building the cooperative and collective cooperative commonwealth. That message still holds true, and that is still here. So I really, I think what you're giving here is, again, the recognition that this is not merely just an expression of the outreach committee, but is where the pulse of the life of the church is found. And you can hear it if you keep your ears close to the grassroots, right? That's, you got to keep your ear to the ground on that. Stephen, what I want to do now is I want to turn back to you. We're kind of going in a circle here. Is I want to talk about, perhaps maybe some of us on the call are thinking about, okay, great, how do I get involved? What do I do? And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about your experience with the CIT program and what that was like, as you even began to explore at your own congregation, some of these sort of conversations. And then, then we can talk a little bit specifically about the Bible study on the toolkit, because you were an instrumental part in creating that. Can we turn to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think one of the challenges around this work is what I consider two realities that must integrate. One is lack of exposure to this work and lack of awareness to this work. And I tell people, if you give a community awareness and leverage to its resources or accessibility, they can change their own communities. It's when we put the resources on lockdown, when we monopolize the resources, when we redirect the resources outside of the communities where they are born and bred, and we play games, economic games with people's lives, then you see all of a sudden real estate values go down, schools go down, the whole economy of the landscape goes down. But then when you have gentrification, as an example that's happening here in Nashville, all of a sudden that same property a year and a half later is 4 times the value when a different group of people have invaded and extracted the whole livelihood of that community. So the church has a way to step into that space and say, this is not justice. And the challenge with the church, I contend in many cases, is we have become so member focused. We only want to take care of ourselves, and we don't want to take care of ourselves from an economic standpoint necessarily. We just want to make sure our buildings are pristine, that there are certain rooms that certain people can't go in. We preach a well-crafted sermon. It doesn't cause people often to feel uncomfortable or liberated to the extent that they'll go out and make sure that they're partnering with people who are on the margins and people who are in government, because I believe that it takes all of us to really start to realize government has a role to play in this, churches have a role to play in this, nonprofits have a role to play in this, because that's part of God's humanity. It's when we set up these dividers and all of a sudden we put labels on things that are very, very unhealthy. So churches, by its mere existence, is about discipleship. And I tell people all the time, discipleship includes cooperatives. No, Jesus doesn't use those words. But if you think about what discipleship is, it's bringing people together to advance the kingdom of God. Very simplistic. So please don't shoot me down for a theological simplicity statement. But the whole key to this is, how do we make sure that we've taken the blinders off? And here's the beauty of this work as the church. We are called to deconstruct the economies of the day. That's what the prophets did. And if you say that's long ago, that's Old Testament, that's what Jesus did. And it's to the extent that once we start to deconstruct, we have to decolonize. And part of this work is we've all been colonized at a very high level. And so we think the norm is the norm. And Jesus is calling us to do a 180, to pivot in these moments of crisis, to say, Isaiah 43:19, I am doing a new thing. Do you not perceive it? It's coming up right before your eyes. By the way, I contend in this economy that we are people of God. We are the new thing that God is doing. So we don't have any more excuses. We don't have any more time to waste. There are people waiting to connect us to this new alternative. It has to be principled, though. It has to be value driven. More importantly, or as important, it has to be mission driven. And sometimes the church missionally drifts, I use my hand, so forgive me, missionally drifts from what Jesus has called us to be and to do. So one of the things that we are challenged with at our particular location, we're trying to not wait until someone's 25 years old or 35 years old to discover cooperatives. We're trying to plan a school that is owned by the community, so we can start to teach kids at pre-K. So imagine teaching the cooperative values and principles at pre-K through 4th grade, and then 5th grade through 12th. Then we have a whole different level of economists. They are homegrown. And so we don't have to regurgitate what we've been taught from someone else. It's part of their natural fiber of their being. So the challenge I contend continues to be, how do we shift from this whole idea of, when we're hiring people, skill set, to a theological mindset? So we can treat the mind well, we can raise up another generation that walks out of its doors with the idea or cooperative as a natural flow of being, as opposed to just doing. It is the doing that wipes us out, because there's no equity in today's doing. That's why we have to create centers and circles of solidarity around the generation that's coming before us, the generation that's 2 generations behind. If these babies can do digital, if they can play on Mac computers at the age of 2, if they can manipulate data on a cell phone, guess what? They are primed to doing this work at a very young age. So I think the church has a responsibility around spiritual development, to embed in the DNA that's already there, to help tease out a problematic explosion around what shouldn't be, to a narrative, a new conceptual reality that says you belong in a different economy and you get to participate in that, regardless of your age, your class, any of that, because we belong together.
Thank you. I mean, I felt I was just at church. This is wonderful. We're preaching here tonight. And it's great to even get at this in the chat. So Bridget is asking, who are the cooperative theologians? Well, look at the Wendland-Cook Program. Come work with us. We're happy to think about this cooperatively together. And we're not just talking about academic theologians. We're talking about people on the ground. We're talking about Stephen Handy, Benny Overton, Bianca Vasquez here. This is people's theology here. Some of what, well, there's one thing that I just wanted to note on, because it was just providential, perhaps something going on there. You use the word solidarity circles, and that is the new project that we got coming in the spring. And very quickly, solidarity circles are virtual peer networks of organizers, faith leaders, and clergy who are interested in getting involved in the cooperative and solidarity economy. So we're going to meet for monthly for 5 months. We're going to help you develop a plan of action in your community about how it is you can take action at your institution, at your church. We're going to provide you with the consulting, the coaching, and the relationships of people to walk with you and accompany you as you do this work together, because isolation is, I think, just baked into the basic notion of capitalism. It's meant to divide us apart, to make it feel like we're not, that no one else is thinking about these things tonight. You got, 50 people here just on the Zoom call that are interested in this. So we're not alone. We can do this together. Take a look at the application that's in the chat. Reach out to us if you're more curious about this. I wanted to turn to Benny and Bianca here a little bit to talk about how it is that we bring more people into this movement. Bianca, you talked a little bit about the origin story of the Beloved Community Incubator, but you've also mentioned a couple of other congregations, and you just put some in the chat here too. So can you talk to me about your experiences in working with churches and how we bring more people into this movement?
Yeah. I don't know if this is the right time for this, but I did make a list of like 6 easy things that congregations can do. So I do want to make sure to share that. And then I can just share some some specific ways we're collaborating with churches right now. So one is if your church has an endowment or does granting or giving funding. Also, like Catholic Campaign for Human Development, as well as the Presbyterians, have funding that can go towards supporting cooperatives. So connecting local cooperative groups with religious funding. The Domestic Hunger Program in the ELCA, you need a church partner to apply for that funding. So lots of interesting ways around funding. I think another big thing is looking at what efforts are already happening in your community, particularly led by Black, Indigenous, and immigrant communities. Your building is a huge resource that you have, a huge resource, especially if your context is undergoing gentrification. Space to meet and space to gather becomes a huge resource. You also have significant purchasing power as a congregation. So where do you buy everything from your energy to your paper to who does your cleaning to who does your snow removal, all sorts of kind of purchasing questions for your context. I have to plug the Organizing for Mission Network alongside the new program here, only because they're slightly different. And Organizing for Mission Network does contextual gatherings across the country. And so you get to see other congregations and how they're specifically using the tools of organizing. So if you have the question of how does my congregation get connected to what's happening in our community, it's a specific place to engage some of those tools. The last thing I have is fiscally sponsoring another local group. So churches have a lot of infrastructure, right? They have bookkeeping and payroll and building insurance and lots of things. And in sort of extending some of, BCI was fiscally sponsored by Luther Place Memorial Church for 2 years because becoming a 501c3 is a really cumbersome process. But there's lots of groups. I also work with our local mutual aid group that also runs out of the basement of Luther Place, where they're doing diaper and food distribution out of the basement locally. And that's not a group that's connected to a church, but their values align. So there are lots of folks that are values aligned with your congregation. So those are my quick 6 that I thought about as I was sitting here. But I'll share the ways in which we've collaborated with some local congregations. So there's a local food catering cooperative that brings together worker owners. They're working with churches for commercial kitchen space. And so we're providing the legal TA to help the churches and these food entrepreneurs work together around space. So that's a huge one. Luther Place Memorial Church, that's a church of our origin story. I was on staff at Luther Place when we started doing the community listening that birthed Beloved Community Incubator. But we're also, we have 2 to 4 projects at any given time. One is we're organizing house cleaning cooperatives. And why we're organizing house cleaning cooperatives is that it's primarily women of color. It's heavily undocumented. Domestic workers aren't covered under the same labor protections. And so we're working, we try to partner each cooperative with a church support team. So folks that are just about supporting the process, whether that's reviewing the website or doing evaluations or actually giving specific trainings. We had congregation members give trainings on conflict resolution and marketing and vision and mission. So folks that have really professional skills in their 9 to 5, having a place to look at, like, where does my faith and my work intersect? We're also organizing street vendors. So street vending in the District of Columbia without a license is a crime, punishable by up to 90 days in jail. So we have an organizing effort that's happening with faith communities around decriminalizing street vending and creating a sidewalk vending zone so vending can happen legally. But we're doing a winter meal subscription program. So over the course of 16 weeks of winter, street vendors that do food vending will have the option, people have the option to purchase meals from them. But we're doing the testing with church congregations. So to say, hey, each person is going to cook 50 meals to practice. Can we give these to your congregation members to then vote? Let's see. And then we're also working, we've gotten funding from a couple of local congregations as well. And a lot of it is relationship building and space. So we meet at a lot of different churches. But our ideal is that any project has a church connect that can support, that sees it as part of their work to support the project. So those are some of our successes, but we got asked to help support a cleaning cooperative in Northern Virginia. And our first question was like, what neighborhood, and then what's our anchor institution that's there? And like I said, churches have a lot of the economic democracy practices. They have a lot of the caring and mutual aid practices, often though within the walls of their congregation. So it's an interesting opportunity to have church communities stretch to see those practices come into the world while also using well the resources that they do steward.
This is, I mean, there's just a couple of points here. I mean, the list that you've given us here is just wonderful. And I hope people leave recognizing that the possibilities for connection and alignment and accompanying here are there's a manifold, right? In a number of different ways. Like the church has a number of different bureaucratic, personal power that can really advance the cooperative movement here. But I am caught, again, you've said this twice about sort of moving the church outside of its walls. I think that the challenge is that people can, whether we recognize it or not, we consistently think of the church spatially. We think about like where it is on a block, rather than in terms of what the activity is of the church. Think about what it means to, what if being the church is actually doing a certain work, that your identity as a Christian is grounded in cooperative economic practices. That's what it means to be a Christian. That's what it means to be a member of the church. Not whether I'm actually on the member rolls at Third Presbyterian Church or whatever. I think it's much more important to think about your identity as a Christian as constituted by economic, political, democratic practices that are found within the values and resonate with the values of the cooperative and solidarity economy.
Aaron, I think it's interesting quickly is that we talk about Jesus and we want to position him in the temple, and absolutely correct. But we have a very limited view of what happened in the temple, and a handful of stories, less than a handful of stories of Jesus being in the temple. We have a plethora of stories, miracles, relationship building, equity, injustices, tables being overturned. We have all of these stories of Jesus being in the marketplace, meeting people who by custom and norm, he wasn't supposed to be with. But he's willing to be a bridge, not only around relational capital, but equity, right? And so equity becomes an economy in this economy that if we're not careful, we will dismiss it as something that doesn't belong to the church. And so we have to be liberators in the midst of this day and time to simply say, if not us, who? And then here's my question, what's at stake if we don't do this, Bianca, right? What's at stake, Benny, if we don't do this work well, so that we model this generationally? One thing I love about my Jewish siblings is whatever they do for the next 2 generations. So imagine if we do this work cooperatively well, we set up the next 2 generations to do this work and transform the economy of capitalism. Because we've been talking about doing this for how long now? And now we need to put some things in place.
Amen. Benny, one of the things that I'm thinking of as we're thinking of it here is just the local examples of the Southeast, and the success of the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development, of the co-ops and work that you all are doing. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about your examples of starting faith communities? I mean, what I mean here is that this is the work of the church, and you guys are doing it. Southeast Center for Cooperative Development. So can you talk a little bit about that?
About some specific co-ops or
yeah,
something?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I will. Well, let me first start by saying that what we're doing is deepening the solidarity that we have with the faith community, because actually the birth of the Southeast Center came from the coalition of the faith community and labor unions and nonprofits through NOAA. And it was through the task force that I work with NOAA, the Economic Equity and Jobs Task Force, that led to our exploration of co-ops. And then Rosemary and I decided to branch off from that and form the Southeast Center. So I feel like we are just going full circle and coming back and deepening that connection that we've had between the faith community and labor, and the labor movement, because I do consider it still part of the labor movement. Some of the co-ops that we have started, and we are reaching out to the, I guess, the marginalized community particularly. That's our focus. Those who have been excluded and don't have the means otherwise to perhaps start a business that would allow them to start to build wealth, basically. Because particularly in the Black community, the primary source of wealth building has been home ownership. And we were systematically excluded from that for years through government policies of redlining. And then when there was wealth beginning to accumulate, the housing crisis of 2008 just decimated much of the wealth that was there. So co-ops is a way to start to build wealth as you build equity at the business itself. So one of the co-ops that we started, and I'm excited about, is a trucking co-op recently. And we had 3 members, African-American, 2 males, 1 female. 2 of them were formerly incarcerated. So a group that probably has all kind of barriers to business ownership and even jobs, quality jobs. And that's something I'm really excited about. They have started their trucking firm, have contracts. They just acquired their 3rd truck. And so, and this is the type of opportunities and wealth building that the Southeast Center was developed for. Some of the other is a language co-op, and I'll give the name Bosse. And this has to do with, it's a group of, I think, primarily women, immigrant women, who are teaching Spanish language to others in the community, teachers and other people who wish to learn the language. They have recently started and are off to a good start. I'm excited about that. Of course, there's some childcare cooperatives that's in the pipeline. Childcare is desperately needed. And we have a group that is looking at a pretty novel approach to the childcare. And we have, I guess, great expectations for them. I'm trying to think of some of the others. There's several that we're working with now. And we just wish to continue to work. And I wanted to add this, that some of what the faith community can do, both collectively and individually, is to look for cooperatives in your area. Look for cooperatives that you can support and patronize, and give them an opportunity to win your business. Be open to them. And of course, and I think Bianca touched on this, we could use your skills and talents. I mean, your capital resources and your human resources, skills and talents that you have. We could use volunteers at our center. So if you have some skills and talents, particularly in the business arena, and Bianca talked about conflict resolution. When you're trying to work as a group, there's going to be conflict. And so we need ways to constructively deal with that. So someone with talent and conflict resolution, please come by.
I just want to highlight something that I think Benny alluded to and maybe didn't say explicitly. So some worker cooperatives are organized as cooperatives, depending on the state legislation. A lot of cooperatives are organized as LLCs that have bylaws that allow them to be cooperatives. But I want to highlight why cooperatives are so beneficial for workers that are excluded from the traditional economy or marginalized from the traditional economy, particularly folks who are formerly incarcerated and particularly undocumented folks. So as someone who's undocumented, it's not legal to be an employee, but there is nothing that prevents you from being an employer. And so if you are a worker owner, you have a legal way of earning income in the United States. So that's really powerful because it's folks who are otherwise really vulnerable. When I think about, there's been a lot of work around Ban the Box and other things to try to prevent discrimination based on, or for folks who are formerly incarcerated. But if you're the owner, you get to just avoid that question entirely. And so it's really, really a powerful way for folks who have been excluded from the economy to have control, like to create their own work and to have control over their own work. And Margaret, I really fast wanted, she asked, like, how do cooperatives resonate in more conservative areas? Agricultural co-ops are huge in more rural contexts. And there's a large history of Black cooperatives in the South. Collective Courage, there we go, by Jessica Gordon Nemhart, is a really important read. But I think there are values that you can highlight, in Washington, D.C., talking about racial equity and economic justice and economic democracy, right, might resonate. If I'm talking to folks who are more conservative, I'm talking about like self-help and self-reliance and job creation, and you're setting people up that they get to be their own bosses. People like entrepreneurship. So there's just, people, y'all know your context a little better than me, but those are the places where I would start. Like, what are the values that could resonate better with folks for you?
I think that's exactly right. And I think Margaret's question is super important, just to think about the basic, it kind of returns me to the very beginning, that the basic part of this is relational and value driven. About building relationships out of, rather than sort of beginning in these high, big scaffolding conversations about the current political conditions. We can talk about the current economic conditions that we've got in our neighborhood here, and what it means to actually send children to schools that we control. And that is, I think, these notions of control, of democracy, oftentimes cut through a lot of the, I think, the sort of media mill, and that I think that we just really need to kind of cut through. Friends, we've got a couple of questions here. We're at 7:26 in Central Time. So I kind of want to, Margaret, thank you for your question here. Friends, there's lots of great resources that are going on in the chat. Bianca there's a lot, very active here. I love it. But there's this question here that was placed from Torin. that was sort of, how does one move a church towards the quote unquote extension of the church walls? And I think this is, this might be a question that any of us can answer here, but I do kind of just want to say first off that one way of going about this, I think, is meeting people who are already doing it and learning from their experiences, talking with them, organizing with them. Join a solidarity circle, fill out the application, explore with us the basic, what are the basic tools that you need in terms of theology, in terms of church, but then also in terms of basic, like building good cooperative businesses requires some of these smarts that Bianca and Benny have been talking about before, conflict resolution, but also accounting, but also like building a good business plan, doing a feasibility study. These are things that you don't get taught in seminary that actually are super vital to church building. So friends, what is, any responses, any experiences that you've got to Torrin's question? How does one move a church towards the extension of the church walls?
I like to start with listening campaigns. So internal and then neighborhood listening. So folks, if you haven't done community listening before, doing internal listening first, where people are relating to people in the context of the congregation, learning about dreams, hopes, motivations, and then moving on to neighborhood listening and seeing where there might be overlap. It's a really, really short answer, but that's my favorite way for people to get started. And Organizing for Mission Network is the place for that if you want specific listening campaign resources. It's just done powerful, super powerful things for many of the congregations I've been engaged with, and also myself.
Bianca, let me affirm that and say you're absolutely right. One of the things that we did around this boys' school that's in the midst of being launched is we heard in 2018, there was a study released that 37208 was the most mass incarcerated zip code in the country, not in Nashville, not in the state of Tennessee, but in the country. And so we said, wow, here is a problem that isn't the church in position to partner and solve. And so we started meeting with neighborhood groups. We started meeting with governmental officials. We started meeting with other churches, hearing the people, right? We want this to be the people school. You all ever heard of a people school? We wanted this to be a people school because if we're going to change the educational trajectory, right, of our children, then we have to have a different level of control. Because if they tell us what we can't teach, so imagine if there's a curriculum around cooperatives in every school that we launch. And so what we've decided is we're going to launch schools. Now, you may have heard of launching churches, right? But really you launch the gospel. So we're going to be launching schools. And the primary reason is we need to take back control of how we educate the minds and the spirits and the hearts and the souls of our children. And so this is not a church school per se, but it's birthed out of our understanding of discipleship. And so I always tell people, if you're a church person, if you don't use discipleship in a conversation when you're talking about movements, then I would be leery. So stick discipleship in there when you're dealing with cooperatives. It fits and it makes a whole lot of sense.
I also think one other point here that I want to sort of push us on, and I know we're at the point here, is also like there isn't this sort of alternative of we need to start new churches to do this, or that we need. There is also the reality that the church itself is already doing this in the labor movement. At BCI, this is the church. These are people of faith who, sometimes perhaps they're people of faith doing this sort of work. So the question is, may not necessarily, it may be just sort of, are the frames that we're using to understand the work of the church poorly fitted for the actual work that needs to be done? And if we affirm that the church itself is doing the work and can continue to do the work, then the question is, okay, how do we go about supporting it? How do I find the people, I identify them? How do I put them in relationship with each other? How do I accompany them? And how do I refine and equip them with the right competencies and capacities to do the work better that can allow for greater democratic and worker control in our political and our economic life? Benny and Bianca and Stephen, I want to give you Yeah, Margaret, that's a great question in terms of PCUSA and Catholics. The ELCA has done a lot here too. UCC is, I'm not quite sure if they're on a national, but at least the PCUSA, and I think check out the Fund for Self-Development of People at the PCUSA. That's a good place to check out. It's guided by the right values. Catholic Campaign for Human Development. So those are great resources there. But let me, I want to give our panelists here any sort of the last words before we wrap up. Sam, if you can place the link to the Solidarity Circles again, that would be wonderful. And we can give a benediction here. Benny, Bianca, Stephen, any other final words?
2 words, toolkit. Toolkit. In case this may sound overwhelming or too daunting to take the first step, we have spent about 18 to 24 months putting together one of the most remarkable cooperative think tank strategy mapping, you name it. It's all inclusive. And here's what I invite you to do. Try it. And I'll put my name on it, although my name is on it. I'll put my name on it to suggest that if you allow your congregation and other congregations to do this in a collaborative way, 4 or 5 churches together on this, I guarantee you can start to change the face of your communities and restore dignity in the lives of God's humanity.
Benny or Bianca, any final words?
I would just say, I think, sorry, Benny.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Okay, I would just say, I think a lot of congregations over the past 18 months have been really concerned about racial equity or racial justice or anti-racism. And cooperatives, worker justice are a means of doing racial equity and anti-racism work. And I think we often see it as racial equity or anti-racism is like a learning journey and not something that's rooted in actions and outcomes. And cooperatives can provide really tangible outcomes in people's lives. And when I think about like the life of Jesus, it is about like dealing with the material conditions in people's lives. So I'm excited for you all to take on that work. I'll be joining the Solidarity Circle myself. So I'll be excited to be journeying with you all.
Benny, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I would just like to say that, in my opinion, what's happening and what we're trying to do is to bring about economic liberation. We've been caught in this economic servitude, this system of economic servitude, much as the slaves that were in Egypt and needed to and sought liberation. Yeah. In the same way, workers today are seeking liberation. They're seeking honor, someone's honor and respect and value the human being that's workers. And this system is not doing it adequately. And so what we're talking about is this economic liberation. And I welcome the faith community to join us and to find a co-op development center or cooperatives and pitch in. Together, we can make a difference. We can transform the economic system, but we have to require the economic system meet our basic requirements of respect and humanity, and be in a place where humanity and the humaneness of work is recognized as important, not secondary or tertiary. So.
That's right. Amen. And what better message of freedom and liberation is the truth of gospel, right? That's what being a church is all about. That's what discipleship is a real sense of social, economic, and political freedom. And we're not talking about heaven here. We're talking about being humans together. And that's real. Thank you all for being here together. Fill out the application to join a Solidarity Circle. Thank you to Stephen, to Benny, to Bianca. What a rich conversation. This will be recorded and be sent to all of you who have attended, and to anyone else if you would like it. Share the word and spread the news. All right. Be well, everyone. Thank you.